Welcome to Our Own Voice, a partnership in mental health awareness in cooperation with Nami Wichita and KSUN Community Radio. Nami is a national alliance on mental illness. We are the largest grassroots advocacy network for people with mental illness and their family members, with over 800 national affiliates and 15 Kansas affiliates, with Nami Wichita being one of those 15. We provide awareness, support, education, and advocacy for people affected by mental illness. Our purpose here is to provide a community conversation on KSUN Radio that gives insight into what it's like to live with a mental illness. Our intention and our hope is that our program will change attitudes, assumptions, and stereotypes about people with mental health conditions. My name is David Larson. I am very pleased and proud to be your host today, and I am a person living with mental illness. I am in recovery for major depressive disorder. Like everyone, I struggle with the ups and downs of emotions and the challenges of being fully human, but I am doing great, and I know I have many gifts to offer my family, my friends, and my community. And it is my pleasure to introduce our guest for today, Dr. Loeck. Hello, doctor.
Hello. Hi.
So, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Good. Well, let's jump right into our questions here. And where did you grow up and where did you graduate high school from?
Well, I essentially grew up in Connecticut, and I graduated from Staples High School in Westport, Connecticut.
Staples. And what is the mascot for Staples?
It's a wrecker.
A
what?
Yeah, it's basically a construction worker, wrecker, like the hat, and yeah, it's big hammer. It's a wrecker.
Hey, that's good.
Yeah,
That's unique.
Not quite Thor, but yeah.
Sounds dangerous to me.
Well, so not to age you or anything, but about how long ago did you graduate from high school?
It'll be actually, 20 years ago now.
Okay.
You made her do the math.
Yeah, I know. I'm always making people do math. I like math. I got my undergraduate degree in math.
Then
So
you should
I
do the
actually don't
math and
mind
not
it.
ask her.
Well, it was more just a shock to the system that I was like, wait a second, it's 2019. Oh my gosh, it was 20 years ago.
it's hard to believe that. Yeah. So, so from high school, you went where for college?
Went to University of Vermont. I was actually a physical education major. So I took a very long and convoluted route to becoming a doctor.
Okay.
So started off there. It was physical education, exercise and sports science, and athletic training. And I worked as an athletic trainer, certified athletic trainer in a high school for about 6-7 years, and coached various high school age sports and younger, and decided part of the way through that I wanted to continue my education, and here I am.
Okay. So what is your connection with mental health issues?
Well, let's see. In med school, because I had mainly a sports background, I wanted to go into med school with a completely open mind and figure out which part of medicine, which specialty of medicine really kind of spoke to me in a way. Maybe interested with, I loved athletics, don't get me wrong, but it was kind of the same thing you were treating day in, day out. Okay, oh, you sprained your ankle, great. Rest, ice, compression, elevation, boom, you're done. It's the same thing, rinse, repeat every day.
Right.
When I got to med school, there were parts about the behavioral science curriculum that I really found interesting, and I liked just the problem-solving kind of aspect to it. And when I got into my clinicals, it was the only one that I didn't run away from the hospital screaming because I wanted to leave as quickly as possible. I actually wanted to stay. It was working with the populations. It was always problem-solving, always interesting. I was never bored. I have to deal with ADHD myself, so having to kind of keep myself interested and keep myself moving, keep myself constantly like mentally engaged into something, it's kind of difficult to do. And this is one of those things that just spoke to me.
So working with the brain was the trigger for you to delve in deeper.
Yeah, it was. I always kind of say that you put 20 people with one diagnosis into a room, you've got 20 different stories, you've got 20 different treatments, you've got 20 different ways of having to approach things. There's no two people who are alike. There's no two treatment plans that are alike. So you're constantly having to keep adjusting, keep moving around, keep shifting. And to me, that problem solving is just awesome.
So if somebody
great.
sprained their ankle, the question is which one, left or right?
Pretty much, yeah.
And if they have issues, mental health issues, then you really got to dive deep in to figure out how they're affected, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. I mean, you really have to get to know the person a little bit. You've got to be able to reach them in a way that they can understand and the way that you can understand them. And that's not always particularly easy, but figuring out something that you can relate to the person and be able to explain something to them in a way they'll understand, it's always challenging, and it's always kind of keeps me on my toes.
Well, so we're going to take a quick break now, and we'll be right back with Our Own Voice. Welcome back to Our Own Voice, a partnership in mental health awareness in cooperation with Nami Wichita and KSUN Community Radio. Nami is a national alliance on mental illness. Our Own Voice is intended to humanize a misunderstood, highly stigmatized topic of mental illness by showing that it's possible and common to live with a mental health condition. So, Dr. Loeck, let's jump to the topic of stigma. How have you experienced stigma yourself? How have you seen stigma play out in the mental health industry?
That's a loaded question in
It
a lot
is.
of different ways.
Yes.
So actually just going based on something we were all talking about earlier, the DSM, or our Diagnostic Criteria Manual for Mental Illness, started off by naming some of the common disorders, stuff like hysteria, instead of anxiety. And it implies that the person is hysterical. And it puts a negative connotation on something that person is suffering with. And if you look now, I mean, things are, at least in terms of criteria and how things are described, it's a lot more kind, I guess you could say. But unfortunately, as we learn more, the original diagnoses and the way that they're described, it still kind of sits in people's heads. And people of different generations have a different connotation that goes towards different mental illness. For example, in the 80s, probably earlier than that, but I'm dating myself. That's when I grew up. I mean, you knew the kid in class who was running around, who was always getting trouble, who was always talking when the teacher was talking. You're like, okay, well, that kid has ADHD. So you associated it with a behavior problem, with somebody who wasn't doing well in school, who was not able to keep control of themselves. And when you're older and we're learning that it's not just the little boy running around in a circle, it's a lot of other things, and it presents differently for people. It makes it difficult for people to actually go and get help. And it's a stigma that comes from ignorance in a way, because if we didn't know how everything was, and then all of a sudden the more that we learn, we realize, okay, things change. And it still makes it difficult, because if you grew up with this mindset of, well, that's not me, but I'm still struggling with inability to concentrate, not able to focus, but I can have ADHD because I'm not that little kid. So it makes it difficult for people to come in, because then there's also the stigma of, okay, well, I'm an adult. I should be able to do this. I should be able to do that. I should be able to concentrate. I should be able to get my job done right.
But those things don't necessarily happen.
Exactly. And it makes it really difficult for the person. And there's that fear that comes from, okay, I don't know. I don't want to ask for help, but it's there. So in terms of stigma, I mean, it's difficult in an academic environment. There's a stigma with ADHD that, okay, well, hey, you're just saying that you have this because you want a stimulant. So there's that aspect of it. There's another aspect where even in the medical field, it's very difficult to be able to, let's see, like when somebody comes in and they're asking for help with something and they want, like they say, okay, well, this is a medication I used to be on. There is a connotation that goes with certain medications. And it still follows us to this day. I mean, there are some things that it's going to take a little bit of time, but it makes it really difficult for people to come and get help.
Okay. Well, I know personally, I've had an internal stigma that I've had to fight with the depressive mode. Not
that's
just
what she's talking about.
Yeah, not just the outward stigma that people would have towards someone with a mental health condition.
Yeah.
It's the internal stigma that I have, and yeah, it's real. It's there. It affects people.
Yeah, it affects. I mean, it affects a lot of different aspects to things. It affects how you act. It affects how other people act towards you, because that's why people don't like to go out in public sometimes, is because they're afraid of how their illness is going to present. I mean, people with panic disorder, they can't help it if they have a panic attack in public.
Yeah.
And it can look bad. And it's embarrassing. I mean, people feel that kind of shame from having something like that because they don't know how people are viewing them. They just need help and understanding to be able to get through what they're going through. But it doesn't come off that way. It's the, oh my gosh, what's going on kind of situation. So, I mean, it's very frustrating because you don't have that stigma with something like having high blood pressure.
Right, exactly. We
I mean,
talked about that
yeah.
at one point. You're identified by the stigma of having an illness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Exactly. Well, I want to take a brief moment here to offer a thank you to our production team. Thank you, David Peterson, for being our executive producer.
You're welcome.
And thank you, Mike Padilla, for being our technical producer.
thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we are talking with Dr. Loeck, and we are talking about mental health issues and mental illness, and we are going to take a quick break, and we will be right back.
If you would like to learn more about the National Alliance on Mental Illness and how you can get involved in mental health advocacy, please visit our website at nami.org.
Welcome back to Our Own Voice, a partnership in mental health awareness in cooperation with Nami Wichita and KSUN Community Radio. Nami is a national alliance on mental illness. David, I'm going to turn to you this time, and what do you want to say?
Well, I want to say a couple things. First of all, that beautiful intro music was composed by our host, David Larson. And
Thank you.
Also, I want to give out a number, 316-686-1373. And that is the NAMI answering service, and we will get back with you as soon as possible. But it is so important if you have a crisis going on, and if it's a true crisis, call 911. But if it's something you want to talk to somebody about, just give us a call, 316-686-1373. We have programs, we have support groups, and just talked with a lady last night. Her son was going through a crisis, and so often we forget that when the person is going through a crisis, the family is going through a crisis also. And we can offer some family support and possibly get them involved in a class to have them some better understanding. But we also have other programs. And one of the programs we have is Ask a Doctor. And that's a very well-attended program. It's the third Tuesday of every month. And it precedes our support groups, which we break up into family support and peer support groups. But I know Dr. Loeck, has done the Ask a Doctor, and I want to know, Dr. Loeck, Was that your first encounter with the National Alliance of Mental Illness?
Yes, that would be, yeah, I would say that's the first time. I did join kind of peripherally when I was in med school, but that was the first time I actually had any like real involvement with NAMI. And I was very pleasantly surprised. It was a lot of fun. I mean, it takes a little bit of time for everybody to warm up, and usually have to sit there and say, hey, I'm going to start talking about sports if you don't actually start asking me questions. So if you don't want to hear about that, then you better start asking. But obviously in a good-natured way. But no, I mean, it was a lot of fun, and it was nice to be able to offer at least some help for people, even if it was in a general way, and make people feel a little bit more comfortable about, I mean, scary psychiatrist. I mean, you don't want to, there is some of that little thing about, hey, being a shrink. Hi. I mean, we're not all that scary.
Stigma again.
Exactly.
Yes.
Well, except for I fully embrace the term shrink. I actually you gotta have to have a sense of humor about your profession, and that's kind of the way that I embrace mine.
Yes.
Is that because your head is normal size?
It was a term that was used for psychiatrists way back in the
Oh,
day.
I see. I see.
So no,
Well,
it was like head shrink.
I just know people who, head shrink. That
Yeah,
was
and
what
it's
I was-
usually a negative term, but
Yeah.
to be honest, I mean, if it's not used in a negative way, and like I said, I take some amount of pride in that. And
Sure.
hey, I like that. For some
You-
reason,
you've
there's
been on
something
a-
about me that just it kind of like gravitates towards that.
You've been on a long road to get to this point, right? Exactly.
I chose this.
Well,
Okay.
you wear it well.
But
Thank
the
you.
Ask a Doctor hour is totally free for those that like to come, and you can ask the doctor anything, correct,
Oh,
Dr.
yeah.
Loeck?
Yeah, no. Medications about particular symptoms that's going on, a family member, resources in the community. I mean, I know that myself and my peers know a fair amount about that by this point in our training. But yeah, literally anything is game.
Fair enough. Well, let me throw another question at you.
Okay.
And that is, you have had to have coping skills throughout not only your education, but also through the coping skills that you encourage other people to have. So what are coping skills that you have to use for yourself, and what coping skills are there that you give to your patients, or that you encourage for your patients?
Yeah, you know what? It's different for everybody. And I know I keep repeating that kind of same phrase, but really it's what works for you. For me, being able to kind of leave work at work, go home, whether it's painting, photography, just vegging out, watching a movie, just anything to be able to kind of get your mind off of whatever is bothering you. Usually I like to do some kind of activity just in general, whether it's physical activity, whether it's something like being able to use my hands. And you guys can't see me at the moment, but I'm constantly moving my hands as it is. I swear I am not Italian.
It looks
holding
like
onto
you
them
could
now.
be, though.
It's probably one of the only European descents that I'm not. But no, it's really anything that works for you. And at times it ends up being something like just breathing and kind of trying to focus in on what you're doing in that moment. And
Some kind of mindfulness activity or something.
yeah, and again, it's different for everybody, and you kind of have to buy into it for yourself, because not everything is going to work. I mean, if
Yeah.
you don't really think that reading a book is going to help you, guess what? It's not going to help you, no matter how many times I say that it's going to. So you really have to actually want to try something to help yourself out. And it's a behavior.
Do you have to be
thing.
passionate about whatever that is? Do you think?
It depends on what the activity is.
I see.
But also it's just, okay, you know what? Sometimes it's just putting hope out there that this is going to help. And sometimes that can actually do a lot of good.
A lot of good.
Okay,
Excellent.
well, I'm going to take a quick break here. We are talking with Dr. Loeck on Our Own Voice on Kaysen Community Radio, and we will be right back. Welcome back to Our Own Voice, a partnership in mental health awareness in cooperation with Nami Wichita and KSUN Community Radio. Nami is a national alliance on mental illness. So we're just going to ask you another question here.
Go for
and
it.
that question is, when you meet someone new and you need to diagnose them and try to figure out what's happening, how much information do you delve into with their family and how their family relates to that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that actually makes perfect sense. Our diagnostic interview, at least the way that I am most comfortable with it, because structure and me don't tend to work out too well. I just tend to have a conversation. So it's more just figuring out, okay, what brings them in. That gives them a pretty open forum to be able to say what actually is the main problem, or why did they actually walk into my office. But part of our interview in general has to do with their background. Where did they grow up? Did they grow up in their intact family? Were they separated from their family? What did they do in school? Did they have any problems in school? Did they have siblings? What did their family do for a living? And if there was any, we do ask for their family's history in terms of not only medical illnesses, but mental illness as well.
Okay.
So, because there are some, there is some hereditariness to some of our conditions.
Right.
It's a very low percentage in a lot of sense, but it is something that if one person has a diagnosis that has some heritability to it, I don't even know if that's a correct word. Sorry, English was not my strong point.
You're forgiven. It's okay.
Thank you.
It sounded good.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll run
Go
with
with
that
that.
one. But yeah, there is something to that. So if I know that there is some background, I can try to ask some questions about that, like how did they present? Because the other thing, like we were talking about earlier, diagnoses tend to change a little bit over time, and the classifications, how they're actually diagnosed, change, and also the popular vernacular way of saying things. So, everybody, you'll hear this on TV a lot, like, oh, I'm so bipolar. Well, guess what? That bipolar in quotes there is not what the clinical bipolar is.
Right.
They're very, very different things. So I have to do a lot of education on the side of that, of saying, okay, so does this sound like you, or does this sound like you? And it kind of at least helps to clarify some things a little bit
Have
more.
you had a time when you've had somebody that you're talking to, and then all of a sudden it dawns on them, wait a minute, that's the way my mother was, or that's the way my father was.
Yes.
And then you put two and two together, right?
Yeah, well, a lot of times they'll actually volunteer that.
Ah.
Say that, yes, this is, or they'll describe kind of a similar way that the household is,
I
or
see.
something that we call like high expressed emotion. When people in the household in general, if they're talking about something, it's like DEFCON 5. It's like everything is a nuclear meltdown,
Right.
even if it's something that's happy. So, there's different kind of ways, but that affects how you interact with the world. It affects how you interact with other people. And those all kind of can go into the diagnosis as well. So people who complain about certain things being a symptom, that might just be kind of the way that they act. And
Yeah.
they don't think that it is anything abnormal.
Right.
But earlier you talked about somebody with a sprained ankle, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a person comes in, sits down, says, it's my ankle. You can try to look at that.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's a mental health issue, that's...
Well, you're dealing with the person's perception and what they tell you.
Okay.
So if somebody, all right, for example, we'll use I looked on WebMD and I discovered I have this.
Oh.
That kind of a thing. People come in with that, not very often, at least in an outpatient setting, but it does happen.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing with those programs is that you have to put in the symptoms. Well, people only put in symptoms that bother them. So if you ask the average American, all right, well, did you lose weight recently? Yes, I lost 20 pounds. It's great. Well, okay, that might actually be a symptom. And it could point something in a totally different direction. So they might not have a problem with losing 20 pounds. So therefore, they don't think it's a symptom. Like, hey, great. Hey, I lost 20 pounds. It's not the fact that, oh, by the way, there might be something that's causing a problem with that.
Like
but
anorexia,
someone-
maybe.
Anorexia.
But someone
cancer.
says I sleep all the time, but I don't get very good sleep, or I just want to stay in bed. I don't want to crawl out of bed. That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So,
But that's something that is, some people actually love to sleep.
yeah, exactly.
So they don't think that that's a problem.
And
But
some people need to sleep more
Yeah.
than the average person.
exactly. And actually, some people, when they don't sleep, they think that that is absolutely fantastic. But that actually might be the symptom of another mental illness.
Another situation.
So the thing
Exactly.
is that everything is perception. So you've got to be able to not only interact with the person and be able to understand what their perception of things is, but also be able to interpret that into something that turns out to be a symptom of
But
some
you're
kind of a
helping
mental
them to
illness.
clarify the
Yeah.
situation. Exactly.
Because they might not realize it.
Oh, yeah. I think few do they? Do they not? Few people.
It depends on which
Does it?
kind of, yeah.
Yeah, because we go back to everybody's different.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
I
You
hate
got
to do
my line
this.
now.
Okay.
I hate to do this, but we're going to have to cut you off. This is Our Own Voice. We have been talking with Dr. Loeck. Thank you very much for being with us today, being our guest.
Thank you.
And we look forward to our listeners joining us for our next Our Own Voice program.
Thank you.